Good morning, everyone. It's 10:40 in the Eastern Time Zone, and from the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana, I'm Professor Jim O'Rourke. This is 10 Years Hence. Welcome. Our guest this morning for 10 Years Hence and our series on life beyond Earth is Lieutenant General William J. Liquori. He's Deputy Chief of Staff for Space Operations, Strategy, Plans, Programs, Requirements, and Analysis for the United States Space Force. As Chief Strategy and Resourcing Officer, General Liquori has overall responsibility for the strategies, requirements, and budget of the U.S. Space Force. General Liquori entered the Air Force in 1991 as a distinguished graduate of the Air Force ROTC program at Boston University. His career has included numerous operations and staff positions in Air Force Space Command, the National Reconnaissance Office, the Air Force Secretariat, U.S. European Command, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the White House, and the United States Space Force. General Liquori has commanded a Space Operations Squadron and the 50th Space Wing. He's a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Weapons School, and his operational experiences include Operation Southern Watch and Enduring Freedom. Joining General Liquori on our webinar this morning is Kara Troha. She's Chief of ISR Partnerships and Integration in the headquarters for the U.S. Space Force in the Pentagon building. Ms. Troha previously served at the Office of Naval Intelligence in a variety of analytic and leadership roles within the Farragut Technical Analysis Center. Her experience spans scientific, technical intelligence analysis, technical collections operations, deployed intelligence support to special operations forces, and foundational military intelligence. Kara Troha received a Bachelor of Science degree in Aerospace Engineering from the University of Notre Dame in 2010 and a Master of Science in Technology Intelligence from the National Intelligence University not long ago in 2013. So good morning, General, and Ms. Troha. Carol, welcome. It's a delight to have you as the guest of the University of Notre Dame, and for all of those who are now logged on to 10 Years Hence.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. O'Rourke. We really appreciate the opportunity. Super excited to be able to engage on a topic that's is critical to our nation for sure, and our allies. And as I've looked at the speakers that you have lined up for this series, it's quite an august group. I've had the chance to work with several of them, and so we hope to bring the perspective of the United States Space Force to this series today. So we really look forward to it.
Good. Well, we'll offer you a chance to talk and Kara a chance to talk, and our visitors and guests online will have an opportunity to key in a few questions, and my assistant will send those along, so I'll pose those to you directly. So let me just hand it over to you, General, and let you begin.
Perfect. So what I think we're going to try to do today with our prepared remarks is we'll talk a little bit about the establishment of the service, the Space Force, how that came about. I'll turn it over to Kara. She is our intel expert, and I'll have her talk about the range of capabilities that adversary countries are pursuing that ties actually to the creation of the Space Force. And then we'll talk, I'll come back and talk a little bit about what we've been doing about that for the last couple of years. We're in year 3 of our service, and we'll talk a little bit about the way forward. And then we're happy to field any questions that you or the viewers may have. So, super timely topic for sure, but the United States interest in space goes back quite a long ways, obviously back to the 50s, as President Eisenhower was wrestling with, from a national security perspective anyway, ways for the United States to be able to see beyond the Iron Curtain. And at the time, we had been using balloons and aircraft to be able to see what was going on in the Soviet Union, but he and his leadership team knew that it was only a matter of time before potentially one of those aircraft would be shot down, and so they started us on a path to a program called Corona, which was our first spy satellite in space, if you will, took pictures of the Earth from space and deorbited film buckets. So that was really the start of our national security experience in the space domain. And the reality is the space domain and our use of it has evolved greatly over the years to the point now where, the bottom line is space is critical to our American way of life and our American way of war. And so that's kind of where we start this story, if you will, for us. And that was, several years ago, members of Congress on both sides of the aisle began a discussion as they realized and recognized the opportunities that space presented us, and they realized what certain countries were doing to potentially pursue capabilities to counter our ability in space. And so they started a dialogue in Congress. You fast forward to 2017, and as a brand new administration came into office, that was a time where I worked on the National Security Council staff at the White House. And as General McMaster, the National Security Advisor at the time, came into his position, he talked to all of us on the National Security Council staff, kind of an introductory all call, if you will. And one of the things he did was he passed out 3x5 cards to everyone on the staff, and he said, "Hey, we need to focus on strategic issues to be able to help the country over the course of the next 4 years." And he said, "Before everybody leaves, please write down an issue that you think is a strategic issue we need to work." And so space security became one of those issues that we started on. And for the ones that eventually got approved, space security being one of those, we set out to create a national strategy for each one of those. And each of those national strategies started with, what is the vital national interest surrounding this strategy? And so for the space side of the house, that vital national interest was described as unfettered access and freedom to operate in space, first half. And the second half was in order to advance our national security, economic prosperity, and scientific knowledge. And so that set us on a course to guide this national strategy development. And in March of 2018, the president signed our national space strategy. And then, if you believe, as part of the executive branch of the government, and certainly knowing that the legislative branch agreed as well, if you agree that there's a vital national interest and it's important enough to create a national strategy, it's not a far leap to say, hey, maybe it's time for us to have a separate military service focused on this domain in order to protect things for us in this country. And so fast forward several months later, and December 20th of 2019, we have the National Defense Authorization Act, which signed the Space Force into law. We refer to it as our birth certificate, if you will. And so off we went to stand up a new service, the first one in 72 years here in the United States. And we are in year 3. I'll talk a little bit more about the first 3 years, but before I do that, I learned last week that one of my colleagues that I work with on a regular basis was a Notre Dame graduate. And so I asked Kara, I said, would you be interested in joining me today? She works on our intelligence side and is key to any of those things that you rattled off on my duty description, if you will. None of that happens without the intelligence side of things that Kara provides. So I'm going to turn it over to her and let her talk a little bit about what other countries are pursuing for capabilities that may counter our benefits that we get from the space domain.
All right, thank you, sir. Happy to be here. So when we talk about what our peer competitors are doing in space, we often use the term that space is a contested domain. So what we mean when we say that is, space is no longer necessarily benign. As General Liquori mentioned, we want that unfettered access, freedom to operate in space, but our strategic competitors, namely Russia and China, are building capabilities that challenge us to be able to have that unfettered access. So we call these Counterspace capabilities, and I'll talk about a few specific ones here in a few minutes. But getting back to Russia and China, so they are both very well aware of the United States' and our allies' dependence on space, not just for the way of war, military use, national security, but also our way of life. So think GPS, satellite communication, satellite television, everything we do in America depends on space in some way or another. So our peer competitors are well aware of this, and they do want to challenge us in the space domain. So what are these capabilities that I mentioned? It's things as fundamental as Russia and China being able to track where our satellites are at any given time. So space trackers, Think sensors down on Earth looking up into space, or sensors in space looking across space, keeping track of where US satellites are should they want to target them at some point in the future. There's also jammers. These are fairly common. They're the cheapest, oldest, easiest counterspace capability to implement. Basically, they interfere with signals. So satellite communications go down, GPS goes down. It could be because of jamming. And Russia and China employ such capabilities as well. Additionally, there's lasers. Now we're starting to get into some things that sound like a little bit from a science fiction movie, but lasers can dazzle satellites. So think temporarily blind sensors on satellites, all the way up to permanently blinding them and damaging onboard hardware, depending on the power levels there. And Russia and China both have multiple ground-based laser systems that pose a threat to us in space. A little bit more severe than that, there's space-based anti-satellite weapons. So think things already out there in space on orbit that could conduct attacks or pose other similar challenges to us. Russia, they have their Cosmos satellites. We believe these are able to potentially kinetically kill other satellites in low Earth orbit. And they're employed kind of like nesting dolls. So like Russian matryoshkas, if you're familiar with that, a satellite and a satellite and a satellite, little baby satellite, and they can all come out and operate. And then additionally, China, exploring similar technologies, they have something called the Shenzhen 17. This is a satellite that's got a robotic arm that can come out. It's already on orbit today. And we believe in the future, this technology could be used to grapple with other satellites. So definitely a challenge from that aspect. And then lastly, the most dramatic weapon or counterspace capability would be direct descent anti-satellite missiles. So these are ground-based weapons that shoot up into space and target satellites. We've seen China actually test this back in 2007. They launched one to destroy one of their defunct weather satellites. Not only did they demonstrate they had the capability to do that, but by blowing up their satellite, it created about 3,000 pieces of debris. And this debris itself then poses a threat. We have to track it for years and years. And most of that debris is still up there in orbit today that we have to keep tabs on. And then similarly, we believe Russia is developing mobile ground-based missiles with similar effects. So all that said, our peer competitors are definitely, working today and fielding today systems capable of threatening us and challenging us in space. So it's not some far out future threat we need to worry about down the road. It's here, it's today, and these challenges are not just to the military, but to the whole American way of life. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, sir.
Thanks, Kara. So if we take the fact that our American way of life and our American way of war are highly dependent upon space and what the capabilities that we can deliver from space, and then you add to that the capabilities that peer competitors are pursuing, again, it was not a far jump to say, let's stand up a service that's focused on organizing, training, and equipping capabilities for this domain, as vital as it is to the United States. And so, again, December 20th of 2019 is when the Space Force was put into existence. And we spent that first year focusing on establishing the service. That was the theme, if you will, for that year. Now that ran the gamut of many things. For those of you that follow some of these things closely, a lot of the early discussions were about things that I would call our iconography, things like our seal that's in the background here, the stitching on uniforms, logos, flags, those types of things. And in many cases, there was often comments of, okay, are you going to focus on the important things as well? And absolutely, there's a whole lot that goes into establishing the service. But to be honest, when you create a brand new organization, starting your culture in the right way is important. And some of that iconography is a key piece of that. That is what our guardians in the service certainly they are a key piece of that culture, if you will, and some of those things allow them to begin to grow an identity, if you will. So that was some of the early work. Equally important, however, is organizationally, how are we going to structure ourselves? And so, the National Defense Authorization Act was signed into law in December, and in January, we were having meetings to figure out the organizational structure, if you will, because it said start, you're at the starting line right now, go. Now, fortunately, it wasn't 2019 when, as a military, the United States was focused on space, and we previously existed under the Air Force. I've spent the bulk of my career as an Air Force space officer. So we stood on the shoulders of a lot of good work and a lot of high quality leaders that had gotten us to that point. What we ultimately decided was, we knew that this service was going to be the smallest one of all the military services. So a key piece of the organizational structure and our processes need to recognize that we needed to be lean and agile because the threat in our domain evolves very quickly, and because we were going to be a small service. So I'll talk two levels of organization. The first one is the headquarters staff. Every one of our military services, the headquarters staff is here at the Pentagon. And so General Raymond, the Chief of Space Operations, who was the first member of the Space Force, if you will, and for a while was a Space Force of one, recognized that we needed to have a staff here at the Pentagon. And so we basically have four directorates, if you will, on this staff. We have the directorate that I lead, which is strategy and resourcing. So as Dr. O'Rourke said, we look at strategy, policy, partnering, requirements, and ultimately the budget. We had another directorate that's focused on operations, and that's the one that Kara is a part of. We have space and cyber operations as well as intelligence operations, and so they focus on that aspect. The third one is focused on the human capital element, because no good organization survives without the right type of human capital and professional development. And so we have a human capital office. And then last one, which is a little bit unique to military services here in the United States, and I think actually around the world, General Raymond, knowing that space is going to continue to evolve and that technology is going to be on the forefront of that, decided to establish a directorate focused on technology and innovation. So we have a chief technology and innovation officer, and she has a team also focused here at the headquarters staff. We've got a director of staff, and then ultimately we have a vice chief, which is a four-star General David Thompson, and our chief, General Raymond. And then we, like the U.S. Air Force, both report up to the same secretary, the Secretary of the Air Force. So that's our headquarters staff. In the field, every military service has units throughout the field. What we did there from a lean and agile perspective is when we were part of the Air Force, we had 5 echelons of organization in the field, ranging from 3-star down to 1-star to a couple at the colonel level and then a lieutenant colonel level. We decided, because the threat evolves so fast in our domain and because of our size, we wanted to streamline that. So we brought it down to 3 echelons, if you will. And so we have 1 level of general officer, 1 level of colonel, and 1 level of lieutenant colonel. That middle one, or the lower 2, are really key. So we have a squadron, which is very common to our other services as well. That's the first unit, if you will, focused on a particular mission. But unique to the Space Force, as we transitioned out of the Air Force, our colonel level of command is called a Delta. We crowdsourced that actually with all of the airmen and guardians that work in the space business to come up with what they want to call that level of the organization. And ultimately, what's unique there is every one of our Deltas is mission focused on one particular mission. So we have an intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance Delta. We have a Delta focused on position, navigation, and timing. So think the GPS program that many people know. We have one focused on satellite communications. We have several focused on training, doctrine development. So each one of those Deltas is mission focused, which allows us to stay streamlined as we go through working issues for the service. The next thing that we did was now begin to put in place some of the key elements for an independent service. One of the things that every single service does is they publish what we call doctrine. For those not as familiar with the military and the audience, doctrine is a way for us to codify concepts and principles, organizational principles, and beliefs of our particular domain or a particular mission area. So in August of 2020, so less than 8 months into our life as a service, we published our first doctrine document. It's a capstone doctrine document. The only way that we were, to be honest, publishing that in the first year of a service is pretty unheard of across the world. And the only way that we were able to do that, and it's an example that General Raymond likes to use, is even before we were a separate service, we had 22 space professionals that got together. They were officers, they were enlisted, they were civilian, they were from multiple services. They got together and said, if we, they had heard the rumors that maybe a Space Force was coming, and they said, if we really are going to have a separate service, we've got to get about writing a doctrine. And so these 22 bold space professionals, on their own time, off hours, separated in multiple duty locations, kind of assigned each other topics and chapters to write on. And so this work had already been done. We became a separate service. They sent it to General Raymond and said, sir, here's something we've started on. We had a summit where we kind of refined the ideas, and ultimately in August published that doctrine document. And it really focuses on the uniqueness of the space domain. It focuses on why are we here? So our cornerstone responsibilities, which are simply put to preserve freedom of action in the domain, to enable joint force lethality and effectiveness, because at the end of the day, that's why we exist in the space on the military side. And third, to provide independent options to national leadership. The document also focuses on the how, our core competencies, and it focuses on the who and the different disciplines that we have within the service. And so that doctrine document was a key piece of establishment. The last piece I'll focus on in establishment, and there's plenty of others, but it's pertinent to my duty area. Every service is responsible for developing their own budget. And so once we became a separate service, we had the responsibility to develop our own budget. We're actually joined in the room by another Notre Dame alum, Miss Julie Hogan, who's an '86 grad, who is a part of the team that works with me to develop our service budget. And so we put that together. At the end of the day, our entire joint force, so Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, and now Space Force, is postured and designed and planned with the assumption that space capabilities will be there for them when they need it. And if you give the list of capabilities that Kara ran through, that assumption becomes, it's challenged. And so we've got a responsibility to modernize the space capabilities that we have in the Department of Defense. And we focus on 4 areas when we do that. First, we focus on the need to protect what we have on orbit already today, given that range of threats that Kara talked about. That can sometimes be expensive. So number 2 is actually to evolve to more resilient architectures that are resilient by design. So think using different orbits to perform certain missions so that we've got a level of resiliency that's a part of those architectures. The third is to develop warfighting capabilities. At the end of the day, the fact that we are a military service means that we are responsible for the space domain and preserving freedom of action there. So that's the third piece. And the fourth one is to grow new missions in the space area. So as an example, we have numerous aircraft and other terrestrial capabilities that can allow us to do intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And we certainly have our own share of capabilities on orbit, both civilian and Department of Defense or national that can do things like take pictures from space. But there's certain unique capabilities. For instance, in the Air Force, there is an aircraft that does moving target indication. It flies over the battlefield, and with a radar underneath the aircraft, they're able to pick up indications of targets moving around the battlefield. Equally threatening to us as those space threats are anti-access and area denial capabilities that countries are pursuing that prevent those aircraft from getting close enough to the battlefield to be able to do that mission. And so we're exploring right now the ability to be able to do moving target indication from space. And so that's one of those areas as an example for growing new missions. If I pivot to year 2, that was about integrating the service. Integrating that budget. The Department of Defense does various war games where we practice and try to train like we fight, if you will. We've had to integrate into those war games and make sure that those games understand the counterspace capabilities that are out there and we need to be able to wrestle with and what the implications are for our peers and sister services. One of the other things that every service does is it's responsible for its requirements. And there is a forum in the Department of Defense that's run here at the Pentagon by the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's called the JROC, or the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. As soon as we became a separate service, General Raymond became one of the Joint Chiefs, and General Thompson, as his Vice Chief, is our Space Force representative to that Requirements Oversight Council, and we're now responsible for developing our own requirements vis-a-vis space. And so that's one of the things that the directorate that I run does. And the last thing is that I mentioned that General Raymond is a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So that means he sits on a forum called the Tank, which has he and his fellow service chiefs, as well as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they get together, focus on real world operational near-time issues. And that forum is where we build our best professional military advice that we provide to Department of Defense and national leadership. So a couple areas there on the integration side of the service. We also are working on integrating with our allies and partners because the reality is we are far better if we're partnering with allies around the globe, if you will, like-minded nations also developing their own space capabilities. If we can do that in a complementary fashion, we share the challenges, we share the resources, and we develop capabilities that can augment one another. So that's another aspect of what our strategy and resourcing office team does. And lastly, our commercial industry. You know, we are very fortunate in this country, in the era that we're here in this country, that our industrial base and our space capabilities are, we're still the world leader, if you will, and we benefit from a lot of commercial and industrial partners, if you will. And so there's been a lot of integration that we do with them. We have an operations center at Vandenberg Space Force Base in Southern California, where most of the primary operations from our domain and its support to warfighters around the world happens. It's called the Combined Space Operations Center. We have brought allies and partners in to that center, and we have also now stood up a commercial cell in that center where commercial space operators are sitting side by side with our operators, sharing intelligence information and awareness of what's going on in the domain to partner there. So that was kind of the second year. And I should make clear that I don't intend these years to sound like very discrete periods where we're done with establishment because year one is done and we're done with integration because year two is done. By no means would each of those continue through. But as we pivoted to this third year a few months ago, General Raymond charged the staff and the force to begin to focus this year on delivering. And so that means continuing some of the work that we've been doing, but continuing to deliver. We're at the point right now where we have a brand new administration that has come into office. And one of the things that a new administration does is within that first year or so, publishes a new national security strategy. Within the Department of Defense, we'll publish a new national defense strategy, a national military strategy. We have a responsibility to make sure that each of those strategies is informed by all of the things that Kara and I have kind of talked about today. So that's a big piece of delivering for the nation, is making sure that those strategies are informed that way. We've got to make sure our budgets are delivering the types of capabilities that we need. So I already talked about those modernization priorities. But the way we're doing this, we also need to deliver those capabilities at speed. Again, adversaries are rapidly developing capabilities that counter us, and we've got to be able to continue to move to remain the world leader, if you will. And so key to that is leveraging digital technology. And so our budgets are, one of the other organizations that General Raymond stood up was our Warfighting Analysis Center. And our budgets are informed by work that they do analytically in a model-based system engineering environment where we have highly accurate models of our blue capabilities and of red capabilities, and then supercomputers with the ability to do thousands and thousands of runs on various combinations and permutations. That team feeds my requirements team and my budget team to be able to make sure that our budgets are informed by analytical design and war games, if you will, to make sure that we have the right mix of capabilities and the right orbital structure, if you will, to deliver those in the face of the threats that are out there. Our force designs also leverage those same allies and partners that I mentioned earlier. We've brought some of them into the fold on some of these force designs based on different mission areas. And so that further helps us move faster and deliver capabilities at speed. And then our requirements, our requirements exist in a world that was 20th century, if you will. If I was to show you a requirements document, I don't have one in front of me, but imagine, a document, maybe 80 to 100 pages that lists a set of requirements for a particular system. We've really got to move that into the digital world as well, because it takes, upwards of a year or two to actually draft, coordinate a document as it is right now. And we've got to be able to do that faster. And so we're trying to take that model-based system engineering set of models, pull them into another environment where we're connected on the same backbone, and create digital requirements packages, which can then move through the system faster, and then feed our acquisition organization, the Space Systems Command in Los Angeles, California, as well as several other organizations, so that they can begin to do acquisition faster as well. The last thing I think I'd like to talk about on the delivery side, and then we'll stop and we'll take whatever questions you and the audience have. So we talked a lot about delivering capability and the things we're doing with allies and partners. The other thing that we are a piece of, albeit one piece, is our nation's work on developing international engagement, specifically focused on things like norms of responsible behavior in the domain. Now, typically in the United States, the State Department leads that work on behalf of the interagency. And so they would be lead in any international negotiations in United Nations forums or others. But the Department of Defense is one of the people that contribute to the State Department, and the Space Force as a new service is absolutely a part of those types of discussions as well. Because at the end of the day, the worst thing for any of us that operate in this domain, or those of us and you that benefit from the domain, is if conflict extends to the domain. We'd rather that it didn't. And so we want to do as many different things as possible to prevent that from happening. And if working on norms of responsible behavior helps to get the entire international community to a point where we agree to responsible behavior and we can preserve that domain for the benefit of all, we'll be in a much better place. So I will pause there. That was a one over the world of a very busy first 2 years plus, if you will, on the service. And we're happy to take any questions that you and the audience have, sir.
Good. General Liquori, thanks very much. Ms. Troha, thank you. We have a few questions, and I've got a half a dozen of my own, but one of our viewers writes, The Economist a few days ago published an article about the potential use of nuclear-powered satellites in coming years. So his question is this: how and to what extent does the U.S. work together with allies and private companies to develop the technology that will further advance capability to act in space and keep the domain safe?
Sure. So I'll start there. So nuclear power is something that exists already in space. There are several satellite programs that use nuclear power. There are some benefits to that. There's lots of ways to do power on a satellite. Certainly solar power is one of those that we often use, and most people think about. If everybody in their head had a vision of what a satellite is, you're probably thinking about some type of a box and then some wings off the side of it. And those are typically the solar panels. But for instance, NASA had a spacecraft that they put on orbit back in the 90s called Cassini. That had a nuclear reactor for part of its propulsion. They use that because it allows them to go further out into the universe, if you will, and be less reliant, if you will, on solar power. So we certainly know that that is a capability out there. There are companies that work on those things. I think the key for all of us is that it, just like any nuclear power, whether it's on the ground or in orbit, we want to make sure that we're doing that in a safe and protected fashion, so that we're using it and leveraging the benefits that you get from it, but doing that in a safe way.
That seems to make good sense in deep space. I mean, if we were going out to the asteroid belt or somewhere beyond that, but in low Earth orbit, does a small microreactor pose a threat on re-entry?
So I guess the way I would address that is first of all, when we put satellites on orbit, we do that not only with an eye toward where do they need to go and what capability do they need to deliver, but we also say, where are they going to go afterwards, right? When they're done with their usable life. And so those satellites that are out further, let's say geosynchronous orbit. So think, tens of thousands of kilometers out on orbit. Those typically what we'll do with those is we'll boost them further out into orbit, into what we call a graveyard orbit, if you will, out of the operational areas. To your point of your question, low Earth orbit satellites, we typically preserve enough fuel on those satellites to be able to deorbit them. We try to do that in a way that the satellite itself burns up on re-entry, if you will. We don't want impacts to happen terrestrially, whether they be some sort of a nuclear capability or other parts of the satellite. For anyone that has watched, there are times where we have had objects re-enter from space and make the pieces of them make it all the way to the ground. Skylab back as I was growing up, the Chinese space station most recently. And so we have a unit in the Space Force, the 18th Space Surveillance Squadron, that is responsible for monitoring all of the objects that are in space. Right now, monitoring upwards of 40,000 objects. Those objects are working satellites. They're rocket bodies of rockets that put satellites on orbit. They could be bolts from previous satellites. They could be parts of breakups. Kara indicated the 2007 direct ascent missile test that China did on one of their satellites. So we monitor all of that debris as well, so that we minimize the likelihood of what you were talking about, Professor.
A retired astronaut asked me to ask you this question. Are we still tracking Ed White's glove?
So I have to be honest. I do not know the current catalog to that level of detail, but we're tracking things that go back as far as Ed White, I can tell you for sure.
All right. That sounds good. Now I have a number of sort of small questions. One concerns the current semiconductor shortage. To what extent is that affecting our construction and development capability? And to what extent are you worried about that?
Sure. So I would say thus far, we have been able to continue to put in place and put on orbit the capabilities that we need to, on the schedules that we need to, for the capabilities and the systems that we need to have. However, we certainly, as with many others, not just within the military, are aware of the semiconductor shortage, if you will, other supply chain issues as a result of the COVID pandemic, if you will. But thus far, we've been able to continue to do the things that we need to do on the timelines that we need to.
All right. Tara, a question about threats. Do state-sponsored hackers concern you? Do those keep you awake at night? And to what extent do they pose a threat to our GPS capability or our uplink downlink capability?
Sure. So, I'm not going to give a specific answer maybe to state-sponsored hackers, but cyber is a threat to space, as in all other domains as well. And one of the things about cyber attacks is the attribution. It's very hard to attribute necessarily who did them, whether it was a state-sponsored hacker or something else. So cyber threats, though I didn't mention them in my talk earlier, they are a threat to space, and it can go not only against the actual satellite, but ground stations. There's various other data links and data transport areas that can be targeted as well.
Yeah, I think I would just add to that, at the end of the day, there is little to nothing that we do in our domain that doesn't also involve the cyber domain. It's a very, very close, tight relationship. And so she hit it right on the head, as did the point of the question. We certainly rely on the cyber domain to do our mission.
So a question from another viewer, how does Space Force interface with NASA? Do you advise NASA on joint international projects where technology or capability might be shared with adversary nations?
It's a great question. And the very short answer is yes, we coordinate and cooperate with NASA on a regular basis. We both have very different missions, obviously. NASA focused on exploration, if you will, expanding scientific knowledge, and us focused on those three cornerstone responsibilities that I mentioned earlier. But there is clearly overlap. Since we've had astronauts, the military has provided some of those astronauts We've had several of our Space Force Guardians that are astronauts. One of them actually works on the staff here. Colonel Nick Hague was up on the International Space Station not too long ago. So you've got that tie. But we're both orbiting satellites. And so clearly there's technology and things of that nature that makes sense to coordinate and cooperate on. And so we do that on a regular basis. I guess one of the forums that we have, General Raymond and our Secretary of the Air Force also meet with the Administrator of NASA on a fairly regular basis, maybe a couple times a year, and compare notes on what each organization is doing, what types of things we're wrestling with in our budgets, and what types of things we see going on in the domain. NASA will also be a part of the interagency dialogue on norms of responsible behavior. Obviously, the organization responsible for human spaceflight is very interested in making sure the domain remains safe, stable, and sustainable. And so they'll be a key voice in that interagency dialogue. When I worked at the National Security Council at the White House, one of my responsibilities was to coordinate across the US government on space issues. And so NASA was one of those key players for sure.
I have a question here from Notre Dame professor Clive Neal in our College of Engineering. He may be regarded, I think, at least within the academic community, as among the leading experts on the geology of the moon and on the structure of the moon. So Professor Neal says, with NASA's Artemis program sending humans back to the moon for a sustained presence, there is now a focus on harvesting resources on the lunar surface, which requires infrastructure. Does the Space Force consider the moon a part of its responsibility to protect future American assets?
This is a great question, and one that we get often, and the more that NASA progresses with Artemis and other goals with moving humans further into space, it comes up. So the way we talk about this is currently the United States Space Force capabilities that we provide are focused on the geocentric sphere, if you will. So think anything orbiting the Earth. However, to the point of the question, as the United States moves further and further into space, into an area that we call cislunar space, so both the Earth orbit and the lunar orbit, as we move forward there, partially to harvest resources. As resources in other domains become competitive, the same thing may very well happen on the moon and other places. And at that point in time, if there's a need for us to begin to focus there, we naturally will pivot and provide capabilities, much like we do right now for the Earth focus view. We'll move to that area as well.
All right. A couple of other questions. Do China and Russia have their own versions of Space Force at this time? And if so, what could you say about their capabilities?
Sure. So, I mean, I'll take the organizational piece, and then Kara sort of talked a little bit about the capabilities, but I'll let her say a few more things. So yes is the answer. And actually, both of those countries created their versions before we established ours. In China, they have the Strategic Support Force, which is focused on space as well as cyber. And then on the Russian side, they've modified their strategic rocket forces to have a space focused organization. And as Kara alluded to earlier, both countries are actively pursuing not only their own space capabilities, but their own counterspace capabilities.
Sure, yeah, and I didn't mention this earlier, but we know that both Russia and China have it in their military doctrine, right, to develop these counterspace capabilities. This strategic competition extends to space. They want to be a challenger to us, and they want to win.
Kara, could you talk to us, this is slightly off topic, a little bit about your journey from Notre Dame to Space Force? I know we have cadets watching. I know we have a number of young women who are logged on this morning. A lot of people are saying, that's a really cool job. How do you suppose she got there?
Sure. Yeah, I can definitely talk about this. And I will say it's been a somewhat winding road. And at times where I found myself in my career, say deployed in Africa, didn't make sense given my aerospace engineering degree and background. But I started off as an intern right from Notre Dame with the Office of Naval Intelligence. So it's part of the intelligence community, but specifically under the Navy. And I had a variety of jobs there. I started working in an engineering career field. So I actually was using my degree that so much money was spent on. And I moved into a variety of positions. Some were more like international affairs, Paul Mill, econ, political, military, economic analysis, more, you know, political science type roles, which I didn't have a degree in. But, you know, I do think my engineering background helped me think critically and engaging with foreign partners as well. So a variety of jobs within the intelligence community I've had. And then this past May, I saw this position open up and I applied and kind of, you know, laughing, thinking, oh, my parents will be so happy. All the money they spent on my degree might make more sense now. So, you know, it's been a little bit of a winding road, but it's been a great experience here so far. I work for Major General Lauterbach, who is also a female leader, which is really inspirational to me. And it's great to see, especially across the whole Space Force, there's a lot of diversity. So definitely attractive to me and the future generation.
If you don't mind, can I just pick up on one thing there, Dr.
Right
O'Rourke?
ahead.
A really critical piece, and I'm super glad someone asked. You know, at the end of the day, for our organization, its success or failure is based on our guardians, and our guardians are military, they're civilian, they're male, female, non-gender focused. The bottom line is the Space Force is laser focused on making sure that we have a diverse workforce because it makes us a far more effective organization. We're really, you know, that human capital office that I talked about earlier is really trying to reach out through many, many different venues and vehicles to be able to get us the most diverse talent pool we can possibly have. You alluded to our OTC. That's certainly how many of us in the military came into the Space Force. For me, that is, we have the Air Force Academy, which is the academy that services both services. That's a bad way to say it, is the institution that brings us personnel for both services. But we certainly need and value our civilian workforce as well. And so for any that are on the net, if you search Space Force on the internet, you will find our recruiting pages and things like that, and give you vectors for how to be able to pursue this. I'd be remiss if I didn't throw one shout out to Bryce Van Caster, who somewhere there in South Bend is listening to this and at least thinking about potentially following in his mom's footsteps. Colonel Deb Van Caster was a co-worker of mine and has been at the forefront of standing up this new service. And so if Bryce is anywhere near the caliber of his mom, we'd love to welcome him aboard as well.
Good. So, Carol, let me just follow up again. How did you didn't go through ROTC. So did you answer an ad in the paper? Did you go up and ring the front doorbell at the US Navy? How did you get that first job?
Sure, it was actually at a career field or a career fair at Notre Dame. I think it was a football weekend my junior year, you know, put on the business attire that you don't often wear in college. Let's go to the Goog and walk around and hand out resumes that, quite frankly, at that time didn't have a whole lot on it. But I met someone there from the intelligence community, the Office of Naval Intelligence. And I do know that at least in the past, you know, military organizations were there recruiting for civilians and members of the intelligence community. So it turned into an internship. I moved down here to DC between junior and senior year and turned into a full-time job. I graduated in 2010, so the job market was not great then. Certainly not as bad as, you know, a year or two before that, but I was very fortunate to have an internship that turned into a full-time job.
And now you're on the E-ring of the Pentagon?
Something like that, sir.
Yeah, that's good. The only thing I really didn't like about the Pentagon, other than parking, was the food. but the rest of it I thought was terrific. So back to a kind of policy question for the general. The Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering just announced the new National Defense Science and Technology Strategy Project. So one viewer would like to know how this strategy assists your role to support combatant commanders, particularly in the context of streamlining the acquisition process to bring emerging technologies on board sooner. What can you tell us about that?
Sure. So Undersecretary Hsu and her team in research and engineering are a key part of the Department of Defense, and bringing capabilities forward regardless of the domain, but it's certainly pertinent here. And we actually often work with her and her team on various issues focused on science and technology, the strategy referenced here being one of those. A lot of times our capabilities that we put on orbit started with science and technology or experiments and prototypes. And so that strategy that Undersecretary Hsu and team put in place helps us at the forefront, if you will, of capability development. And so being able to, I alluded to the industrial base that we lean on so heavily. They are pushing technology and the bounds of technology on a constant basis. And so having strategies like the one that's referenced in place allows us to best leverage that science and technology work that they're doing and roll that into demonstrations, which then lead to programs of record, which lead to those critical capabilities that help us deliver on those cornerstone responsibilities that I mentioned earlier.
Well, let's talk for a moment about interaction with the private sector. A retired astronaut, whom I won't name, and I were in a conversation about essentially turning over most of the crewed space activities, CREWED, space activities to private contractors, SpaceX, Blue Origin, those folks. Is there concern in the hallways? Let me just cut to the bottom paragraph, that if Elon Musk gets bored, he won't be in that business anymore. Is there some concern that much of our space capability has been outsourced to the private sector, or do you regard that as a strength?
I absolutely regard it as a strength. The second piece, to kind of directly answer the question about the crewed space activity, that's not certainly a piece of what the Space Force focuses on for our particular mission. So that's certainly, as you potentially have more speakers in this Life Beyond Earth series, if you've got a NASA focused speaker, that's probably a great question to ask them. But to go back to, I think our industrial base is absolutely a strength. And I think it will continue to be. I think, Elon Musk, as well as several others who have become very interested in the domain for lots of different reasons. All of that excitement only benefits us. I'm confident that our industry will continue to exist and continue to push the bounds, regardless of which names are involved with it. But at the end of the day, there's some incredible things that SpaceX and many other companies have provided and will continue to provide.
Are we depending on them for most or just part of our heavy lift capability? Do we have any in-house capability to push packages into orbit?
Sure. So they are a piece of the National Security Space Launch Program that we have. I can't quote you a percentage. They're a key piece of it, but there are other companies as well. There's a company called the United Launch Alliance that was a combination of Boeing and Lockheed Martin that also deliver launch capabilities to us. Our acquisition arm is focusing on expanding our capabilities to deliver satellites onto orbit. There are many small companies that are pursuing launch capability, and we are big fans of each of these as they progress. And the more that at the end of the day, the more companies and capability that's out there to put things on orbit, the more benefit that we have, not only as the Department of Defense, but also the rest of the country, NASA and others that are putting satellites on orbit.
A couple of weeks ago, Christian Davenport, a Washington Post reporter, said SpaceX needs NASA, NASA needs SpaceX. Does Space Force believe that you need both of those, SpaceX and NASA?
I would say we certainly need NASA, SpaceX, and every other company that is out there working
Okay.
in the aerospace sector. And we benefit in this country from having an unbelievable sector, that commercial and industrial sector that focuses on this domain. When I started in the Air Force 30 years ago, I never would have projected the types of things that we do on orbit today. I would not have projected that we would have a separate service at this point, but all of that happens because of the industrial base that we have. And so, yes, absolutely, we need that industrial base.
Okay, back to Kara for a moment. You gave us a large figure of objects of varying sizes and shapes that you're tracking. The real question, I suppose, is low Earth orbit getting too crowded? Are we going to have to come to some protocols about launches and reserve parking spots well ahead of time? And how are we dealing with abandoned space junk? It's beginning to look increasingly crowded there.
Sorry, I think I'm going to hand this one right over
Fair
to
enough.
you.
So fair question. So I mentioned that 18th Space Control Squadron at Vandenberg Air Force Base earlier that tracks all of these objects. They track them for the various, for the many reasons that you've highlighted there. They also publish for the entire world a catalog online. It's at a website called spacetrack.org, TRAK. They publish that catalog that says where all of these objects are. They identify currently right now, we in the Department of Defense, specifically the Space Force, then publish anytime that we notice what we call a conjunction, which is when two objects in space are getting close enough that we want to make sure we're paying close attention to that. They publish that on that website. If we have the contact capability for the owner operators of those spacecraft, we notify them as well, so that in the event one or more of those objects can maneuver and we believe that it's close enough and a high enough probability they can do that, so that we minimize those types of things. The question also alluded to reserving spots in orbit. That currently does go on in the geosynchronous orbit. There are orbital slots that each country signs up for. And then you have that slot for a certain amount of time. And as long as you can put a capability in that slot, that keeps satellites separated enough so that they don't interfere with each other. And certainly, from an electromagnetic perspective, but then also that they don't interfere with each other from a collision perspective. So it's absolutely something that we're focused on. Congress has been working for some time to try to transition some of this responsibility for space traffic management, if you will, to the Department of Commerce. And have them focus on that aspect so that the Space Force can focus on the warfighting aspects of the domain awareness, if you will. It's still a work in progress, but we partner very closely with the Department of Commerce on that aspect as well.
Who supervises that? Who oversees the sign-up sheet for parking spots?
Yeah, so there's a couple different places. There's the International Telecommunications Union, and then the FCC here is a part of that from a United States perspective, from the registering of frequencies that you intend to use. So those are two of the organizations that do that.
All right. Could you tell us if there is an international treaty that defines the appropriate use and rights of the different layers of space, much like the law of the sea? And if so, does it define what the appropriate measures might be to defend and enforce the treaty?
Sure. So it's a great point. So in 1967, the United States and many other countries signed up to the Outer Space Treaty. And that treaty defines, if you will, how we operate in the domain, if you will. And it also states that the countries that sign up to that agree that they won't put weapons of mass destruction into orbit. That's the big piece of that Outer Space Treaty. There are also treaties dealing with the use of, in the Outer Space Treaty, it talks about the use of outer space for other countries. Now, the treaties are legally binding things based on legally binding agreements for the countries that sign up to them. The other piece that I alluded to earlier is norms of international behavior. And we, the United States, are actively pursuing norms of international behavior in addition to the treaties. Norms are things that are based on good practice, if you will. And so we certainly want everyone that operates in the domain to do so in a responsible fashion so that we preserve it for, a safe, stable, and sustainable domain. And so pursuing things like, as a country launches a satellite into space, that you announce that it's going to be launched, we talked about debris earlier, or re-entry, that you put your satellites on orbit in a way that minimizes orbital debris, those types of things. Last year, the Secretary of Defense signed a memo out that had tenets of responsible behavior that the Department of Defense would follow, things along the lines of avoiding the creation of long-lived debris. And so at the same time as there are treaties, there are also these other areas like norms of responsible behavior, and the combination of both is what we pursue to make sure that that domain is there for all of us.
Good. So back to Ms. Troha. If you take a look at the list of speakers in this series, you will see a somewhat obscure name on April 8th, and that is Marina Brozovic from the JPL at Caltech. She runs the planetary observation and near-Earth objects teams. So the question I keep hearing is, how dangerous are asteroids, and is Space Force prepared to do anything about that? Marina and her team clearly are watching them, and she has told me about a very large object that will come within 3 Earth radii in March of 2029. She's got her eye on that. So assuming this doesn't involve Bruce Willis or anyone else, what capabilities do we have, and who's paying attention to this?
The individual that you mentioned focused on that.
Just for a moment. And yep, okay.
Sorry, I don't know if I broke up there. So what I was saying, Dr. O'Rourke, is that that is not currently a mission of the United States Space Force. Although, as I mentioned, our conversations with NASA certainly compare notes about any of the types of threats that are out there. But for the time being, it's organizations like the one that you mentioned earlier that are doing those types of tracking and proposing what things to do about it. I know there's an Office of Science and Technology policy that is at the White House that often looks at near-Earth objects and what types of threats they may pose and what the United States should do about that, but currently not part of a core United States Space Force mission.
Okay. I will still keep that in the front of my mind as opposed to the back. There are things I worry about every day, and now that's on the list. Dr. Brozovic said that her team put together the DART project to go out and see if they could kinetically bump an asteroid, and this actually is a small satellite of an asteroid, and see what their capability is. Do they share that data with you? Are you curious about their findings?
So good question. I'll be honest, I can't tell you for sure if we're connected to get actual data from that test, but I would tell you certainly that the Space Force pays close attention to our sister organizations, if you will, that operate in the domain, and that maybe pursuing new technology and other things. So we certainly will be interested to see, how that plays out, and then take a look and say, okay, how is that potentially applicable to us going forward? But as far as specific data being shared, I don't know.
Okay.
I just don't have that information.
So a little later this year, the government of the PRC of China is said to be landing a crewed spacecraft on, I've been told not to use the word manned, a crewed spacecraft on the dark side of the moon. It's a curious choice of locations. I know they're going to bring a flashlight, but does this sort of pose the next step? If they are intent on establishing a base or a permanent presence on the moon, is that now on your radar?
So I would say certainly any activity that countries are doing in space stays on our radar, if you will. NASA certainly pays close attention as well. NASA has their own plans for what to do in, on, and around the lunar surface. And so, as I alluded to before, as we do coordination with NASA, certainly at the Administrator Nelson level and General Raymond level, as well as then the working groups below them, we constantly are in communication about different things, and we certainly want to know what other countries are doing.
All right. Ms. Troha, here's one I think you could probably help with. The simple question is, what happened to those SpaceX satellites last week? There was a swarm of small satellites that went up, and then something happened on the sun, and now the investors are getting grumpy.
Sir, I don't know that I know the answer to that.
I can give a little bit. So as some on the in the audience may know, and whoever asked the question, certainly, as we have solar activity, it affects the atmosphere, and the atmosphere has different layers, and those layers expand and contract based on solar activity. What it appears happened, and I can't speak specifically for SpaceX, but what it appears happened is solar activity prior to the launch. SpaceX made that launch of the Starlink satellites. As they transit to their operational location, they go through that portion of the atmosphere that was affected. And that portion of the atmosphere was affected enough that the shape and surface area and mass of those satellites was affected to the point where they were unable to get them to their operational orbit. And so they're in the process of re-entering and breaking up currently. It's an unfortunate situation. It highlights that operating in space is very difficult. One of the things with proliferated constellations is that we've moved from having just single satellites that were very, very expensive with as many capabilities as you can put on them, to building satellites cheaper, faster, and having singular capabilities on them, but so that you can then replenish. I'm quite confident that the SpaceX team will be able to replenish those and continue to do what they're trying to do. But it's an unfortunate situation for sure, but that's what the current reporting indicates happened.
All right. Kara, it does seem to me that solar activity is potentially a threat to Earth-based communication, to the electromagnetic spectrum. Who is it that keeps an eye on the sun?
I think a lot. A lot of us do, obviously, but NASA certainly specifically has probes that they have sent out to monitor the sun. But there are a number of companies that do space-based weather. We certainly, our operators pay close attention to what is going on with the solar cycle, because it does affect us as well as other space operators. The environment is very harsh. From the sun, from the solar radiation, if you will. We oftentimes have satellites that stop working, and as we do the forensics to figure out, you can kind of put together that, hey, there was a solar flare sometime before that particular satellite stopped working. It's consistent with an electrostatic discharge that might have come from that. And so we certainly in the Space Force pay close attention to the reports that come for sure, because it affects us operationally.
And I'll piggyback off of that. When I was talking about cyber threats, I mentioned attribution. So we can see effects on our satellites or allied satellites, and kind of peeling back the onion and figuring out, was this a peer competitor testing something, or was this a solar flare, or was this an accident, or did something just malfunction? So that's an important part as well.
So we've got a question. It's a little bit wonky, but it obviously comes from someone who worked in this area in the Air Force. And the question says, with Space Force, how do you avoid unnecessary redundancy and fragmentation of effort? And the example he gives is your National Space Intelligence Center operates with the Air Force's National Air and Space Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and then observes some duplication is always good, but I'm concerned about fragmenting intelligence efforts because we only have so much capability. Do you talk regularly with the other services about who owns various portions of intelligence capability?
Sure, I'll take that one. So yes, there's formal processes within the intelligence community on who does what. As you mentioned, there may be at times redundancy, but we're standing up the National Space Intelligence Center because of the threat that I mentioned before and the prioritization of space. So it has not stood up yet. We hope to soon, but it will be co-located with NASIC, the National Air and Space Intelligence Center, but we're working very hard to eliminate redundancy with the parts of NSIC that will be coming over when it does stand up, and making sure that it's lean and agile like the rest of the Space Force, eliminating bureaucracy, redundancy, et cetera.
Yeah, if I could, I'll just piggyback on that for a second. Number one, her boss that she mentioned earlier, General Leader Lauterbach, was a commander at NASIC some time ago, and so knows the NASIC side of the business very well, and is a key piece of establishing a National Space Intelligence Center. One of the things that we're doing, to the point of the redundancy piece, and trying to avoid that, or avoid the negative aspects of redundancy, if you will, is finding the areas where we can leverage being co-located, but still have a separate and distinct organization. The Intelligence Center is one of those. Really, the reason for doing it is to be laser focused, if you will, on both domains. And so this will allow both organizations to do that, but by being co-located, they can coordinate and cooperate. We do that in several other areas with our Air Force counterparts right now. The Air Force Academy, for instance, for the foreseeable future, will continue to train cadets who will become airmen and cadets who will become guardians. Our recruiting service has a Space Force focused part of the organization, but it's shared between. So the Department of the Air Force sometimes has organizations that are air and space focused, but we do a lot of coordination together to ensure we don't have unnecessary redundancy, but we do have domain focus.
In terms of training, is the Air Force Academy your sole source for commissioned officers?
Yeah, no, absolutely not. And it's funny that you asked that question that way, because I said, you've now mentioned the Air Force Academy 3 or 4 times, myself answering the question.
Yeah.
As an ROTC graduate, I certainly owe it to everyone out there from an ROTC perspective. So Reserve Officer Training Corps. Around the United States, we have various ROTC detachments. Obviously, Notre Dame is a very large one. Julie is actually a commissionee from ROTC program at Notre Dame.
As was I.
Fair enough, Dr. O'Rourke. And again, thank you for your service previously.
My privilege.
So we absolutely are working with the Reserve Officer Training Corps program. And as well, the third way that people can come into the military side of things to the Space Force is if they went and got a degree first and then made a decision to come in. We have a program called the Officer Training School that's run right now down at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama. That's the third way to come in from a military perspective. Occasionally we do direct hires for very specific types of career fields and things. The Air Force medical career field is one of those. We're beginning to think about those things, that space may be one of those areas where a direct hire makes sense. The other thing that we're doing is standing up university partnership programs. We're working towards 10 of those university partnership programs with universities that are focused specifically on science and technology and the space domain, that are near industrial sector places where it makes good sense. And so we're looking to establish those university partnership programs as well. Those would then offer any of the ROTC cadets who are at those universities opportunity to take classes, but it also offers someone who's at the university who may want to be a part of the Space Force, but wants to be a civilian guardian like Kara and not come in the military, it's another way that we look to reach out to highly capable folks and bring them into the service.
Thank you for that. I only mentioned the Air Force Academy about 5 times because I was a member of faculty, and I'm protective and defensive of those folks. So back to General Billy Mitchell, who had suggested to his bosses in the Army Air Corps that they stand up a separate academy, and he was roundly criticized and just dismissed. How crazy would it be for me to suggest that Space Force might in future require its own academy?
I don't think it's crazy. I don't think it's out of the realm of the possibility. It's not in the near term, I would tell you. Part of that goes a couple things. Number one, General Clark and the team that are there at the Air Force Academy have just been incredible partners in making sure that the curriculum speaks to cadets that are both interested in the air domain and the space domain. There's a Colonel Jeff Greenwood, who used to work with me out in Colorado Springs, is the lead for General Clark on standing up the space capabilities, if you will, at the Academy. They have a program there where cadets have the opportunity to design, build, launch, and operate satellites. I've lost the bubble now on how many satellites they've put on orbit, but when I was stationed in Colorado, one of the highlights was to always go to the end of the year and listen to those cadets talk about how they operated satellites, many of them having the opportunity to communicate and work with satellites on a scale far greater than I had by the end of my first operational assignment, in all honesty. And so those types of programs are continuing, and the Air Force Academy has just been a great partner through this. At some point in the future, could you see that? Absolutely. Where we are right now with how the Academy is postured with budgets and needing to make sure we maximize the use of every dollar as many different ways as we can, the right answer right now is for the Air Force Academy to continue supporting both services.
Well, they've great leadership out there, and those are smart kids, believe me. General, we're at the top of the hour now, just a moment or two before. Any final comments from either you or Ms. Troha?
Sure, I'll let Kara go first. If you
Sure, no,
like.
great to be here. Great to be chatting back with Notre Dame. And thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, I would echo those remarks. When the public affairs team reached out and said, "Hey, would you be interested in being part of a speaker series with Notre Dame?" I immediately said yes. Of course, in the back of my head, I was hoping I was going to be in South Bend when I was doing it. The world environment has prevented that, but always a pleasure to be able to engage. Thank you for the question. I mean, every single one of those was right on the money and super good questions. Hopefully we've been able to provide some of those answers. And if any of this conversation spurred someone to say, "Hey, you know what, I may want to join that Space Force," we would love to have them, whether they choose to do it as a military guardian or as a civilian. We've got both, and we'll leverage both as we move forward. So Dr. O'Rourke, thank you to you and the team that puts this on. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you for your time and expertise and your commitment to all of that. Thank you for keeping us safe. So I will say that you're still on the short list, and it won't require a 4th star. You can still come as a lieutenant general. Bring Ms. Troha, and we'll put you on the stage at Notre Dame. We're looking forward to that moment.
You got it.
So for everyone else on the broadcast, thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. We have a couple of notes for you. March 18th, Ben Behe from the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory is going to speak on intergovernmental competition in space, what formal government programs are doing now competitively in space. And secondly, we have rescheduled Colonel Eileen Collins. So sorry she couldn't get on that American Airlines flight out of Charlotte, but that sometimes happens. She'll be speaking on the 21st of March, and there'll be more on this. You'll note that's a Monday. It's at 7 p.m. for those of you who would like to join us. We'll look forward to seeing you there. So from the Mendoza College of Business at the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana, thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure to have you here. We'll see you next on March 18th. And my thanks for your time and your interest in this program. Take care, everyone.